Hi fans, please like our video and subscribe to the RotoWire channel. Then please go to rotowire.com/pod for a free 10-day trial.
Welcome to another edition of the RotoWire NBA podcast. We're recording late Tuesday night, December 8th. Nick Whalen here with Alex Barutha. Alex, we are now exactly 2 weeks away from the start of the NBA regular season. We get preseason action beginning on Friday. I think it's going to be a pretty weird preseason. I don't think, the NBA preseason usually doesn't have a ton of hype, and for good reason, but I don't even know if the average person knows that the preseason begins on Friday. And, even though we have like Kevin Durant playing for the first time in Brooklyn and Steph Curry returning and John Wall returning, it just doesn't really quite feel the same. And I don't know like how much of a glimpse we're really going to get of a lot of the things that, a lot of the questions that we need the answer.
Yeah, I think a lot of times we can like point to the preseason and see how guys' roles shape out, right? To some extent, like on new teams, like how are the minutes going to shape up in Charlotte, other teams. But this year, yeah, with guys absent because of COVID, guys on the teams that went deep into the finals resting, like LeBron and AD, I wouldn't be surprised if LeBron plays no preseason games, maybe one. But I think there are going to be a lot of guys resting more than ever. And I don't think we're going to learn as much in this preseason as we would have normally.
I feel like LeBron is going to set up like an entire mini bar at the end of the bench during the preseason and just be like blackout drunk by the end of every single game. I don't know what to think about the Lakers specifically. I mean, we already got some word from their camp on Tuesday that LeBron and AD likely won't play in the preseason opener on Friday. Obviously not a surprise at all. I'd be surprised if those guys play at all in the preseason. And I think, for some of these players, Draymond Green, James Wiseman, we think the Warriors haven't officially confirmed it, but we think they're dealing with COVID right now. A lot of these guys might not even have the option to really participate in the preseason, which means you're essentially hitting the ground running. If you test positive for COVID today, you're out of commission for the next 12 days, and that leaves like a day and a half until the first game of the season. So it's going to be wild. It's going to be crazy for us, having to track preseason lineups and guys, being ruled out, guys being ruled in. It's going to be absolutely insane. And unfortunately, I think this is going to be kind of a mini preview of what the regular season is going to be as well.
Yeah, I think to some extent I think having a lot of preseason games theoretically isn't a great idea, right? Because of the potential for getting COVID. But I also think the NBA wants to see how the teams and the players do with this over like 3 or 4 games before really just straight up jumping into regular season games and getting things going. Because who knows, like we could 3 days or 3 days after the first game, we could find out, there are guys testing positive for COVID and they played with another team, and it just starts the whole snowball again. So this is going to be like you're right. The casual person will not be watching this, but it will tell us, from a COVID perspective, will probably tell us a lot.
I have read a few doomsday type of pieces the last couple of days that I didn't realize people are so down on this season. There were some of like, I guarantee the season, ends up being canceled at some point. Like, I don't think it's going to come to that. I mean, we've seen baseball and we've seen the NFL, kind of navigate through this, and it hasn't been extremely smooth, but look, at the end of the day, this NFL season has felt about as normal as it could. I think, obviously you had Lamar Jackson, the reigning MVP, miss a game last week, but outside of that, most of the key players on most of the key teams have been available. There hasn't been this, incredible rash of injuries because guys didn't have a preseason. It's felt like a pretty normal year. And, the NBA is obviously diving in at a time when cases are at their highest. But I think the NFL, which you're keeping track of 55 plus players per week, plus, significantly more coaches, a much larger traveling party. And, they've done a pretty good job of, seemingly kind of keeping players and staff members disciplined when they're away from the facility. Because I think that's where the real concern is, right? You're not necessarily worried about a player somehow getting COVID at the arena during a game. You're worried about the player getting COVID at a bar at 2 a.m. and then transferring it to the entire team before a road trip.
Yeah, this is why like the rapid testing and testing guys every day, is really going to kind of probably save the season to some extent.
Yes. It would be impossible without it.
Yeah. And then just, if a vaccine becomes viable, just making sure every player gets it, like no questions. That will also be really important.
Yeah. The vaccine thing, I've said this a number of times, but for those who may be new to the pod, I am not a doctor. So when I speak about vaccines, it is not an absolute, but that's the thing that I feel like somebody got the vaccine today for the first time. I read it this morning. It was in Europe, but eventually the vaccine is going to make its way here, and NBA players won't be at the front of the list, but they'll be getting it before you and I will. So, I think that is something that's on the horizon. I don't know how much of a ultimately like a final solution that would be for the NBA. I think if you get the whole league vaccinated, I don't think you just go back to everything being normal, but you would think it would certainly help and at least alleviate, some of these doomsday concerns.
Yeah. They probably still wouldn't be able to do that many fans, until there's kind of like a herd immunity amount of vaccines in the world.
Right.
But it would at least make things easier for the players and just for the league at large.
Right. I mean, the fans thing at this point is just a bonus. It would be excellent from a viewership perspective. It's crazy to go back and watch, every now and then I'll just, watch playoff highlights or, a full game on NBA TV or whatever it is. And like, it's been so long since we've had that. Like the atmosphere is so much better. And the bubble was fine. And NFL games have been fine, pumped in crowd noise. If the alternative is no games at all, you'll take this 100 times out of 100. But I think we're going to, if and when fans are back, whether it's sometime this season or maybe next season, I think we're going to be reminded, just how much more that raises the stakes, especially in the playoffs.
I'm kind of interested, football doesn't have this issue or this kind of dynamic as much, but if there's only 1,000 people at a basketball game or 500 people at a basketball game, even if you're in the mid row, if you're 30 rows up, and you yell something, everyone can hear you.
Oh yeah.
Right. So I'm kind of interested to see what the dynamic of the 500 to 1,000 stadiums are. If you can hear the occasional fan yelling, what the dynamic between refs and the fans and the players will be, because that's just, you can hear stuff anyway, but that's a whole separate dynamic.
So the Warriors got a plan rejected by the city of San Francisco, which is, they're in the top 1% of stringency when it comes to the virus, but they were trying to have 10,000 fans in the arena. And their plan was pretty high concept. I think they were going to rapid test every fan coming into the arena. I would be shocked if another team tries this in an area where the restrictions are a little more relaxed, because it's going to be an advantage. Certainly if you can have, even if you're allowed to have 25%, having 5,000 people in an arena when another team can't have any, that's something of an advantage. And we know how competitive a lot of these owners and teams are.
Yeah, I don't know the hot spots and cold spots for COVID across the country, but Utah, maybe somewhere you could do it, just somewhere where the population.
I think weirdly Utah has been a hot spot.
Okay.
I'm thinking Florida. It's not even about the hot spots. It's about where does the government not care?
Okay, that's fair then.
Yeah. I do want to take into account just briefly a memo that the NBA, it was initially kind of leaked and then reported later in the day on Monday regarding player rest. And, the more I think about it, the more I really don't think that much is going to change. But I thought it was interesting given that, the league kind of had to convince a lot of players to start the season early. If you're a Miami Heat or a Los Angeles Lakers player, you're having the shortest offseason in the history of any professional sport. And then the NBA comes down and says, look, we're not easing up on rest. They did kind of issue a brief follow-up in that memo about the Lakers and the Heat specifically, saying that those teams will maybe get a little more leniency. But I kind of thought that we could maybe bake in 10 missed games for most star players, if not more. And, the league is saying, 1, we don't want you resting players on national TV. That's nothing new. 2, we don't want you resting any players on the road. And 3, we don't want you resting, even if it's an acceptable situation, let's say a home game against the Hornets that's only on local TV. We don't want you resting LeBron James and Anthony Davis together. I understand, obviously, why the league wants this. This has kind of been the goal the last few years. I guess I just expected there to be a little bit more leniency for this specific season.
I did too. The road games thing kind of surprises me because you would think that if anything, you would want to rest someone and keep them in the home market, right? And not have them
Right.
get on an airplane and because that just increases, your chance of catching something. A team goes on the road. They're probably, I don't know if they're more tempted to go out, but they're in a hotel room. So that aspect of it's strange.
Well, the other thing too with that is if a player is being rested, the NBA, I don't know if requires is the right word, but is strongly advising that the player be visible to fans. So, they have to be at the arena and preferably on the bench.
That's crazy.
I mean, I don't know. Is that really if you're put yourself in the shoes of like a 15-year-old kid going to see LeBron James for the first time, and then you find out an hour before tip off that he's not playing. Hey, but he will be sitting on the bench. Is that any consolation for you?
No, you're just gonna stare at him the whole time. I understand that you have to do some things for marketing and for brand image, but just making sure that LeBron is in a suit deep on the bench in Charlotte or Cleveland on a Tuesday just because you want him to be there. So the 200 fans in the arena can just look at the back of his head and they can pan to him on ESPN, be like, LeBron's resting. What's he got in his coffee cup?
Right.
It's ridiculous.
So what do you make of this? Obviously, I don't think that you read I could be wrong on this. I don't think you read the entire 134-page document that the NBA threw out yesterday. But my take is just kind of look, they do this at the beginning of every year, and every year, only one or two players or teams really get fined or reprimanded. Usually, basically what it comes down to is if James Harden says, "Hey, my hamstring really hurts tonight, I can't play," is the NBA really gonna do whatever work they have to do to prove that he could have played, and spend the resources and then find the team? Probably not. I think at the end of the day, teams have gotten pretty good at, if you need to manufacture a reason to rest somebody, you can do it.
Yeah. And I think I saw a fine. They could get fined up to $100,000 for most organizations. That's nothing. They throw $50,000 guarantee. You got Exhibit 10 guys who they know are just going to end up playing in the G League, right? They do that every year.
I will say the fine is at least $100,000, but still, it's not like they're going to fine a team $20 million.
Yeah. It's probably just to stop someone from doing 10 games in a row or something like that, because that would just get excessive. But yeah, I hope they would be more lenient, and it's kind of surprising they aren't. Maybe, I don't know. If you really want to rest the next day, you can just, pretend you got hurt in the middle of a game, go to box someone out and just pretend you pulled your arm,
exactly.
My shoulder, and then you just sit the next day.
My last point on this is teams that are on national TV a ton are now somewhat at a disadvantage. I went through and looked at, so we only have the first half of the schedule. The Lakers are on national TV. I think it was 17 times. It was 42% of their games are on national TV. And if you also are not supposed to rest players on the road, I ran the numbers, and that left 7 possible rest games for LeBron James and Anthony Davis, and you can't rest them together. So, you know what I mean? All of a sudden you start narrowing it down, and it's look, their teams are going to violate this. They're going to find ways around it. And then the flip side of that is if you're the Hornets or the Cavs and you have no national TV games, you can basically rest players whenever you want at home.
Right. And the national TV schedule is kind of weird anyway. The Pelicans have more national TV games than the Bucks.
Yeah.
And so it's but they're probably going to want to rest Zion at points. The Hawks have one national TV game, and they have a deep roster. So maybe they're just at, an advantage. I don't know. This season is going to get very weird. This is a season to expect weird things to happen. It just in general, but also in fantasy and in betting. It's going to be things. I want to say things are going to get out of control, but I don't think anything is going to run as smoothly as anybody hopes that it will.
Speaking of things getting out of control.
Yes.
James Harden. He did report to Houston on Tuesday. That kind of a surprising move, considering he, depending on who you follow and who you believe on Twitter, appeared to be at a nightclub in Vegas 18 hours ago. So yeah, we don't need to run through the details of that situation. If you're listening to this, you're aware of what's going on there. I don't think James Harden has changed his stance. I think everything, there was a story from Woj on Tuesday morning indicating that Harden still wants to be traded. And the real news item in that story was that the 76ers are another team that he would consider as if he were a free agent and had this choice. So it's such a unique situation because, well, he's not a free agent. Well, he's under contract for this year and next year, and then a player option for 22, 23. He's the type of player and the type of person, as we've seen over the last few days, that if you ship him to Sacramento, you can't just expect that you're getting, the James Harden that we've seen for the last 6 seasons. I think there's, this certain element with him that it's like, you could trade me wherever technically, but I will only, I think there's a chance that he's basically subversively threatening the Rockets and other teams that, look, if you trade me here, I'm maybe not going to give 100% effort.
It's crazy. Yeah, it's kind of an unprecedented situation. We've seen trade demands before, but he's taking it to a whole nother level. It's tough too because he knows that he wants to be traded to contenders, right? He wants to be traded to Brooklyn, he wants to be traded to 76ers. Other contenders have been thrown around as an option. So he's trying to get traded to a team that already has another star player on it, which I understand, but it's a pretty short list.
Only 7 teams had a better record than the team he was on last year.
Right. And then if they trade their second best player for him and young and all their depth and so it's tough. There are other possibilities that you can make up. You can make up plenty of trade scenarios for Harden that make sense, especially if you have 3 teams involved. But a lot of those are him going to rebuilding teams for their rebuilding pieces. And then Harden, like you alluded to, doesn't want to play for the Kings. He might not want to play for the Bulls if he is if the second best player on the Bulls at that point is Kobe White. So this it's a rough situation. And he's basically tanking his own stock in the NBA by being so belligerent, essentially.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, at risk of sounding like, an old man, I'm with you on this. I think this is really the first time that I've kind of felt strongly about that. I think a lot of people got on Kyrie Irving and, for forcing his way out of Cleveland and Anthony Davis, of course, for getting out of New Orleans. But I think to be so brazen about it and, to not show up, at least the Anthony Davis situation was a mess. I'm not going to excuse that. I think anybody who's angry about the way he handled that, I'm not going to say you're wrong, but I mean, at least Anthony Davis showed up. I mean, he was there. It was super awkward, but he didn't just head out and hang out in Vegas. I mean, it's really just kind of rubbing it in the face of the Rockets organization, of Stephen Silas, of, teammates, John Wall. Didn't he say they had a productive conversation 3 days ago? What the hell was that conversation? It couldn't have been that productive. It's just, and like you said, I don't think, maybe some of these guys just don't care. I think if there's anybody who just honestly, truly doesn't care, maybe it is James Harden, but I don't think these guys realize the damage to their reputation, that they're potentially doing. And maybe the thought is hey, the risk is worth the reward. It certainly was for Anthony Davis. I think unless you're a Pelicans fan, nobody talks about that anymore. You go to LA, you play super well, you win a title, it's all fine. But if you don't, I mean, this is a pretty major stain on a legacy that's already, somewhat in question based on how he's played in the playoffs.
Right. That's a good point about Anthony Davis because nobody, he was going from a situation that had been bad for, what was it, 6, 7, 8 years, basically. He had been a part of the team for a really long time. They signed him to a deal. They put a ton of pieces around him. It didn't work. They had one good playoff run, right, that entire time. Harden, just basically taking a hold of the franchise, doing pretty well for the most part, and then being upset when it kind of all crashes down around him, partially because of him, in a large way because of him and Chris Paul couldn't get along. I think that's still, I mean, if they had Chris Paul the past year, that would have been incredible. You saw what Chris Paul did this year. I don't know, man. This is kind of I've heard people compare this to Kobe Bryant, and his, wanting out of LA. I think that makes sense. But then they ended up getting Pau Gasol. I don't think the Rockets are going out and getting someone for Harden and being now you can stay.
Well, they did that the last 2 years. Who's that guy? First it was Chris Paul, or before that even it was Dwight Howard, and then it was Chris Paul, and then it was Russell Westbrook. And I know none of those guys were perfect fits when you're talking about, a guy who's so ball dominant in Harden, but I think that's the root of the issue. All other guys who have forced their way out have usually not been the problem themselves. I think you could even look at like LeBron when he left Cleveland or when he left Miami. It was like, look, I've given all I can here. You guys just haven't put anything around me. Our teams just haven't been good enough to win. I don't know that that's really the case with Harden. It's more so been the team has been good enough. It hasn't been, 2017 Warriors dominant, but it's been good enough. Like teams have won titles with lesser supporting cast, and the common denominator has been you not playing well when it matters most. And I don't know how just forcing your way to another team solves that. I don't think the organization ultimately is to blame. I think they've put the best possible team around him given the circumstances.
No, I completely agree. He's been to the playoffs. He's played 85 playoff games with the Rockets, right? But the problem is he gets worse in the playoffs. He is, since joining the Rockets, 42% from the field, 32% from three in the postseason, 4.4 turnovers to 7.1 assists. Those aren't good numbers.
Right.
So it's tough. And as dominant as he can be in the regular season, it's like these teams that were around him were better than LeBron, the LeBron teams a lot of those times in Cleveland, like you were alluding to. And
right. And for them, like where's the trading Kyrie for Isaiah Thomas move? Where's the not re-signing Malcolm Brogdon move? There seems to be this like ill will toward the organization. I just don't know like what this team has done that would produce those feelings. I
have no idea.
All right, let's look into potential trade possibilities. I've put everything on the table here. We know about the Sixers. We know about the Nets. We don't have to dig into those. Their packages, I think, are pretty clear, ultimately, what they can each offer, and there are benefits and drawbacks of both. I've divided the remaining contenders for James Harden into 4 tiers. So we'll start with the actual possibilities, and that does include Philly and Brooklyn. And I'll throw 2 more in there. I think the third most likely team as of right now is the New Orleans Pelicans. You have Zion Williamson as an attraction for James Harden. You're not putting Zion Williamson in a Harden trade. You have Brandon Ingram, who you could potentially deal. You have, maybe not like another fantastic young talent on that team, but you have several recent draft picks who at least are fairly appealing. Talking guys like Jackson Hayes, Nickeil Alexander-Walker. You have Lonzo Ball, if he's at all appealing to Houston. You have the Steven Adams contract. I don't think you could trade that right now, but if you need to create money, you could throw that in there. Like they have an interesting combination of young players, veterans, high money players, low salary players, and then on top of all that, all those future Lakers picks that they got back in the Davis deal.
Yeah, I've heard that one thrown out there, and I think it makes sense. I don't know. I think as the Pelicans, you're worried that he just doesn't want to be there, right? And that like him and Zion is just, it's not going to be enough. Like he's not going to want to stay, and like they should be a playoff team if that were the case, but the team around them again would be awful, right?
Well, that's the danger with the situation. It's basically like trade me somewhere where I can have a great chance to win the title this season or else.
Right. That leaves you so few choices.
And the risk all lies with the team that's trading for him, which is also unique. Like for the Rockets, it's like, look, if you're willing to give us Brandon Ingram, Lonzo Ball, Josh Hart, and 4 first-round picks, like that's your problem now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if I was Houston, I would do that.
Oh yeah,
that would be a great trade. That would make me nervous.
Yeah,
I can't say if I was the Pelicans general manager that I would do that. It's tough.
Yeah, you almost need like a free agency type of agreement with James Harden. You need you need him to sign something that says like I will try. Just like the Timberwolves had Wiggins, just all he had to say was I will try to get better, and they gave him the max. All right, the 4th team that I'll put in this category, the Chicago Bulls.
Why not?
Zach LaVine, I think to certain talent evaluators is probably really valuable. To others, not so much. But you have that. He's on a near max. You have the Otto Porter contract as an expiring. You could throw in if you need to. Maybe Kobe White. You have Satoransky, who's a decent role player. One of Wendell Carter or Lauri Markkanen. You have the number 4 pick in last year's draft, Patrick Williams. Ultimately, I don't know if this package like beats what the Nets could offer, or ultimately, I think if you can get Ben Simmons, that's probably that's probably what happens. And we'll see if the Sixers are willing to do that. But I think the Bulls could kind of cobble together a similar type of package to what the Pelicans could offer.
Yeah, I think you have to consider that if you're the Bulls. Swapping Levine out for Harden, and just you would hope to get back like probably Eric Gordon, Trevor Ariza. I mean, if you are a lot of these, basically bad teams, you would probably hope to get a lot of Houston's kind of veteran depth just so that he's kind of satisfied. Because otherwise your roster is Harden, Thomas Satoransky, and Daniel Gafford. Like that's your roster. You just can't. That's going to be no good for anybody.
And the appeal for Chicago is you're instantly back to relevancy right away. You have a new front office that's probably not the route you want to go. You'd rather probably develop your own talent, but you are relevant right away. You're almost certainly a playoff team in the East. And I think the city of Chicago, at least, is probably more of a selling point than the city of New Orleans for James Harden.
Well, New Orleans.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it depends on what you're selling.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. All right. So I have 4 teams in my exile tier. These are like if you're Houston and you're really just kind of trying to rub it in on Harden and trade him to a place that he doesn't want to go. These are the 4 possibilities: the New York Knicks, the Atlanta Hawks, the Sacramento Kings, and the Memphis Grizzlies.
This is like the Kawhi to Toronto.
Yes, the spite tier. I should have called it the spite tier. Yes. The Knicks, ultimately, I don't know if they have enough. I mean, you're building that package around RJ Barrett. You're basically throwing in the kitchen sink. I mean, it's RJ Barrett, it's Obi Toppin, it's 4 future first-round picks. The only reason they're included in this is because it's the Knicks, and this seems like something that they would do. It's kind of the same case with Chicago, where you're just begging to be relevant, and this makes you extremely relevant, at the snap of a finger.
Yeah, I cannot imagine the Grizzlies trading for Harden. I can imagine the Knicks trying it, and I can imagine the Kings trying it, and to some extent, I think Travis Schlenk in Atlanta would take the call. The Grizzlies, I think they really like what they have, and they are a team that has a very specific culture, right? Through Mike Conley, Marc Gasol, Tony Allen. That's kind of bled into the guys they've drafted.
Josh Jackson, right.
Right. But the guys they're building around, right? Like Morant, Jaren Jackson, even someone like Valanciunas.
I thought you were going to say Dylan Brooks. Whew.
Well, I just think that would feel just so wrong, wouldn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Bargain to the Grizzlies would feel awful.
Yes, and I think this is probably the least likely of all these, and that's saying a lot because most of them are extremely unlikely. But I think you're testing the water on how much Houston likes Jaren Jackson, who has been extremely injured over the first 2 years. And I mean, if you really want to be relevant right away, you trade Morant. And I don't. Obviously, you wouldn't do that, but that's if you're willing to put John Morant on the table, the Houston Rockets are going to be willing to talk to you. So that's why they're included. Atlanta, a lot of assets that you like, but maybe not love. If I'm Atlanta, I would consider trading Trae Young for James Harden straight up. I don't think the Hawks would ever do that. But I think James Harden with that team around him, I mean, I don't know. I love a lot of the moves Atlanta made. Honestly, one of the drawbacks for me, for as great as Trae Young is can you actually win with a guy that small and that bad on defense? Harden is not, Tony Allen, but at the same time, he's a hell of a lot better and a hell of a lot less of a liability than Trae Young. Again, I don't think the Hawks would trade Trae Young, but I think that's something that if I were running the Atlanta Hawks, I would consider.
I think you have to consider it. You would immediately go to close to title favorite, like maybe under top 4 contender.
You wouldn't be the favorite, but I think you'd be right up there with Milwaukee and Brooklyn in the East.
Right. And yeah, I'm with you on Trae Young. Trae Young has grown on me. I like him as a player, but at the same time, there are concerns about his height, his defense, stuff like that. I mean, if you have Harden and Bogdanovich and Gallinari and John Collins, and he's already played with Clint Capella.
Right. I'm saying, I think like Trae Young is enough of a swing piece that you don't have to include half of those guys in the trade.
Right. You should be able to keep John Collins, and you should be able to keep most of your other young guys too, because Trae Young is really the only, I think, viable single player that you could get other than Ben Simmons, right?
Well, the caveat with Young is the money. So you would have to include some of those guys just to make the money work. But, if we're talking league rules, you'd have to wait, I think, to trade guys like Gallinari and whatnot for salary reasons. But you could make it happen. And
it'd be a 3-team deal or something.
Sure.
Yeah.
And, again, teams don't make moves like that when you have a young star going into his third year. It's just way too risky. And I think especially for a team that hasn't been relevant for a while, it would be a wild move. But like you said, I think that automatically vaults them. I certainly wouldn't make them the favorite, but you are definitely in title contention if you are essentially swapping out, let's say, Trae Young, DeAndre Hunter, Cam Reddish, and Danilo Gallinari's contract for James Harden.
Yeah, 100%. You would be in that conversation with Milwaukee and Brooklyn in the East.
And the last point on that too is I think that's a good enough situation that you're not super worried about Harden's
That's
mindset.
what I mean. Yeah, 100%. It's a city that he likes, right? And it's a team that has some sustainability in terms of, like, Gallinari will be good now, Bogdanović will be good now and later. John Collins is someone that will continue getting better, and if they really need to, could flip him for another potential star, right? And really push the pedal all the way down.
Well, and here's the other thing with Atlanta is that team can offer James Harden playing his James Harden style. If you go to Brooklyn or you go to Philly, you're fitting in alongside Joel Embiid and Tobias Harris and whoever else. You go to Brooklyn, it's even more of a conundrum trying to play with Kyrie and Kevin Durant. So I think who knows if Harden still wants to play like that even, but if he does, I think that's another big selling point as well.
Yeah. Sacramento
is on this list just because, maybe they're still high on Marvin Bagley. I think that's where you start. I think Rashawn Holmes maybe has some value. Neither of those guys are going to move the needle a ton for Houston. But if you're willing to include De'Aaron Fox, that's where things get interesting and where this kind of becomes like the ultimate, we're exiling James Harden to Sacramento deal.
Yeah, if you're willing to part with Fox or Bagley, I mean, maybe, yeah, because they would want Fox. I don't think like Bagley, Halliburton, and picks will get it done. I just don't. That's another. If I'm the Kings, I don't know if I do that, and I don't think Harden would be happy there.
I don't know if I do it, but the Kings are in the same category as the Knicks, right? Where it's like, I wouldn't do that, but they sure might.
Yeah, they definitely fit that bill. Yeah.
All right, tier 3. These are the teams that take the call, but ultimately I think say no because it's just too risky. They're already too good. The Milwaukee Bucks, the Boston Celtics, the Miami Heat, the Denver Nuggets, and this team I couldn't really figure out where to put them, but I wanted to talk about them, so they're in this tier. The Phoenix Suns.
I didn't even think about the Suns as like a potential option for Harden. I need a moment to even process that. I think if you're the Bucks, do you only take the call? What's the situation in that you take the call? Who are you trading?
I think you're trading Chris Middleton.
Right.
I think you're willing to trade virtually anybody on your roster except for Giannis.
So it's just Middleton. I don't even know. I don't think, can they even trade Holiday this soon after he was traded? I don't know. I don't know all the rules.
No, but I mean, theoretically, this deal could take place, after that deadline or at the trade deadline too.
Yeah, I just don't think the Bucks have like the young players to get it done, right?
No, I don't think so either. And the other problem is all your picks are now in New Orleans.
Yeah, they don't have picks.
Yeah, it's not likely.
The Celtics, I mean, you probably talk about it for Jaylen Brown. I don't even think you have a conversation about it if it involves Tatum. And the Heat, I just feel like he does not. I'm sure James Harden would benefit theoretically from playing on the Heat, right? # Heat culture. Get him in shape, have him play more team ball. But that was kind of also my argument for like him going to the Warriors potentially. It's that he doesn't fit and that he would have to kind of mold the team, which is something that I don't think he wants to do. So that's kind of rough.
Yeah, I think for the Heat, it's too much of a culture risk. Although I think you could flip it and say, we don't get bossed around by anybody. And any concerns we have about this guy showing up out of shape or not trying, like we're basically going to beat that out of him. He's going to get in our system and it's not going to be an option. He's going to fit in and we could maybe make him even better because he probably hasn't been in the greatest shape, the last few years in Houston. I think with the Heat, it's like, what do you trade? You know, you're probably not giving up Jimmy Butler. And if you're Houston, I don't know if you really want a guy at that age. It probably starts and ends with Adebayo, right? And if you're Miami, I don't think you're doing that.
Yeah, I think Houston would be interested in Tyler Hero and Duncan Robinson and Kendrick Nunn and just like that entire swath of young guys.
Yeah, it's just I still don't know if it's quite enough. Like I'd rather have the Nets package with more picks and more risk that the Nets, kind of dismantle after 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, that feels like something that's more of like a package you would try to do to get Bradley Beal or something.
Yeah.
Not James
That's like
Harden.
a package you would trade for 2012 Harden, not current Harden.
Yeah.
I want to go back to Boston though. I think it was on the Simmons pod this past week. He's just like glossed over the Celtics. He's like, oh, they're not trading Jaylen Brown. They won't do it. Like, this is James Harden. Why would you like Jaylen Brown is not Jason Tatum. I love Jaylen Brown. I think he's going to be really good, but I think he's like absolutely the type of player you would have to consider trading for James Harden.
Yeah, if you put Harden and Tatum on the same team, that is, again, the roster around them would be questionable, but they still have Kemba Walker, probably. And
I think so.
Yeah. And Marcus Smart. Tatum.
I mean, the roster currently isn't all that great with Jaylen Brown and Marcus Smart in Boston, right? I mean,
yeah.
I think you have enough. You could sell Harden on that big three, and that's essentially what he'd be going to in Brooklyn anyway.
And Tatum is like the only kind of player the only kind of other star that Harden like has not played with lately, right? He tried to play with Dwight, who was a center, and he tried to play with guards recently. Mm-hmm. He hasn't had like an elite forward, which I think is the kind of player that has to complement Harden, right? Kind of an elite second ball handler forward who can play defense. Like, I mean, Tatum would fit on any team in the league, right? I'm not saying like a ton here, but
yeah. Well, I mean, he did play with Jeff Green, but I get what you're saying.
And Trevor Ariza. Yeah, I think if you're Boston, you have to take that call, right? Because I like Jaylen Brown too, but I don't think he's ever going to make an All-NBA first team.
No.
So, yeah.
No,
and he may never even make an All-NBA second team.
Yeah. No, exactly. I think especially, I mean, this Boston team should continue to get better, but it's kind of ran its head into the wall the last few years in the playoffs, and I don't know. I mean, it feels like Boston is in on every superstar, and then he gets traded somewhere else, and then we learn like, oh man, they were 1 day away from sealing the deal. Like, I feel like eventually they're just going to push their chips in and do it. And I know Harden, like, it's such a unique situation too, because he's like universally top 5 or 6 player. How many other top 5 or 6 players would you have to think this much about fitting into your team?
Yeah, not that many.
I mean, if you can get LeBron James, you get LeBron James. If you can get Kawhi Leonard or Anthony Davis or Steph Curry, you just do it. Like we would never be having these conversations about, oh, will they try? Will they fit in? It's just a really weird situation.
Yeah, because like Jokic would fit in anywhere. Giannis is kind of a strange fit because he had his spacing, but he could play. I mean, he can play like 3 positions, so it doesn't.
He becomes your team. Yeah, I don't think you worry about that. Like you get Giannis. So what about Denver?
I think they should take the call, but I don't know, man. Putting Harden with Jokic, it could be fun. I think it would be fun, but I think you also want the ball in Jokic's hands more than Harden would be willing to give it to him. And part of what makes Jokic so special is his ability to find people on off-ball cuts and stuff like that. And Harden is just not going to cut. He's just not going to play that style of basketball. It would have to change the system entirely in Denver. And I don't know if you want to do that.
Yeah, Denver's in the same category for me as Miami, where it's like objectively, it probably makes you a better team. But at the end of the day, I think there are just too many other factors that make it not worth it.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, they could put together, they could send Michael Porter Jr. and picks and, they have options, right? Maybe you give up Jamal Murray if that's what it takes. But
who would you rather give up? If you're Denver and you're like, all right, let's make a deal, and Houston says we'll take either Murray or Porter. If you're Denver, who would you rather hold on to?
I'm still worried about Michael Porter Jr.'s injury situation. Yeah. I feel like you could, if you sent him and got Harden, you could end up winning that big time because Porter could just hurt his back and then hurt his back again, and then he's out of the league by like 2025, right?
I also, we haven't seen much of like a playmaker for Michael Porter. His ceiling might be 31 points a game, 9 rebounds, like 1.5 assists. I think he's going to be really, really good. I don't ever look back. I don't think a team is going to look back and be like, man, I cannot believe we traded that guy for an MVP than James Harden. Like I think ultimately that would end up being a fair deal. With Phoenix, again, I don't think this ultimately happens. The most obvious one is like you build a trade around Chris Paul, but if you're Houston, you have no interest in bringing in like a 36-year-old who you already had. What about Devin Booker? I mean, Phoenix to me is also in that category with the Knicks and the Kings, where it's like you just do things that don't always make a lot of sense. This would not make any sense at all, but James Harden is better than Devin Booker. You'd be reuniting him with Chris Paul. This is probably has the most comedic value of any situation.
You can't put him with Chris Paul again. That's the problem with this. You just can't do it.
No, I'm half joking with that one. But the other guy I think is Ayton. Could you build something around DeAndre Ayton?
Maybe. Yeah, you can maybe do that. But again, Harden, Booker, and Paul on the same team is like it wouldn't be that different from, I guess, like Durant and Kyrie in terms of like guys who all want the ball. Right. I think it would create I think that would create a toxic situation, having those 3 guys on the same team.
In this scenario, I think you're looking for a third team to take Paul. You're saying like, look, we didn't know this was an option at the time. Sorry, Chris, we would rather have James Harden. We're just going to move you somewhere else. Like, I don't know. Again, very, very, very unlikely, but something to consider. All right, my final tier are the Ask Me Again in a Month teams. These are 3 teams that I don't think, I'm not sure which side says no, but I don't think a deal happens now. But I think things could happen between now and once we get a few weeks of the season under our belt that could maybe prompt something. And those teams are the Clippers, the Raptors, and the Warriors.
The Warriors one, I can't get out of my head. I just feel like they would do it because the window is so tight for them to win another title. And as much as I think they would be okay with kind of letting Steph, Clay, and Draymond just kind of like fade, kind of into like Warriors history, kind of like the Celtics were going to be willing to do with like Garnett and Paul Pierce before they were eventually like, sorry guys. I think I'm still that one won't go away for me. The Clippers, they're in a rough spot, man. Like they're in a great spot because they have Kawhi Leonard and Paul George, but the team chemistry issues, I don't think that's going away because you hire Tyronn Lue and you get Serge Ibaka instead of Montrezl Harrell. And both Kawhi and Paul George, I think, have player options for next year, or at least Paul George does. That's a lot of pressure on you. You're building a new stadium. Would be nice to have James Harden in a new stadium potentially. And the Raptors, yeah, I'm a little worried about them this year. Also said that last year. But I don't know if he's like they have one of those like culture things too that I'm not sure.
They're the new Spurs.
Yeah, they kind of are.
Well, so I think with the Raptors, the sun is maybe setting on the pipe dream of getting Giannis, and we'll see. Maybe that changes in the next few weeks, but I think you're kind of looking for your next guy to carry you for the next 5 or 6 years, and I don't know. I mean, you'd kind of be selling low, I guess, on Siakam, who would have to be the obvious swing piece in that deal. But you could throw Siakam, Kyle Lowry, who's essentially an expiring contract in a year or two. I don't know. I don't love that deal for the Raptors or the Rockets really, because you'd be bringing Harden onto like a pretty low caliber team. Yeah. But Toronto's one of those teams that there's been so many trades like PG ending up in OKC that came out of nowhere. I feel like the Raptors will at least like be in on this somehow. With the Clippers, like you said, it's the contracts I think that make it complicated, because if you're trading, you'd be trading Paul George. One, do the Rockets even want Paul George? I mean, talk about a guy whose stock is at an all-time low. Yeah, I think that's kind of a tough sell right now. Although I think people have now probably gone too low on Paul George. Like he was like the runner-up for MVP 2 years ago. I mean, he's still a very good player, and I think he's better than a lot of the guys we've been talking about as like a main piece that you'd be getting back. So there's something there. If you could build something around Paul George. And if you're the Clippers and you could turn Paul George into Harden, I think you do that in a heartbeat, right?
You do that, yeah. I just don't think the Rockets want 30-year-old Paul George as like their main. I'm sure they would take it, but he would need to promise to like re-sign with you, right?
Yes. So that would be the caveat. But I mean, the other thing is like if we were having this conversation last offseason, you'd be like, oh hell yeah, we could get Paul George for James Harden. That'd be huge.
Right.
Like things have changed so much for him that again, I think it's gone too far into the negative. And then with the Warriors, like you said, James messaged me yesterday and asked me about it, and he's like, would you include Clay in a deal for Harden? And I just can't see them doing that. Like that would be pretty ruthless. But at the same time, from like a business perspective, I think Klay Thompson's going to be fine when he eventually comes back. But I also thought that 3 weeks ago, and look where we are now. One, does Houston even want Klay? I think he's more valuable to Golden State than he is any other team. And he's coming off of 2 very serious injuries, and he's in his 30s. So, that starts to mount. But you can still offer your own future picks, the Minnesota 21 pick, the Wiggins contract if you need money, Kelly Oubre, as kind of a short-term situation. James Wiseman, like they have other pieces. Like it's not off the table.
No, I think I actually think including Thompson would be the Rockets would take Thompson's contract. It would be a contract dump for the Rockets to take Thompson.
Really? Okay.
Yes. He's going to be 32 when he plays next, and he's coming off an ACL and Achilles. And he's owed $40 million a year through 2023, 2024. Trading him for Harden would be a contract dump, basically. I don't think if you're Houston, you want him. I think you want Wiseman. I think you want Oubre/Wiggins. Does anybody really want Andrew Wiggins? But those are the guys you would take plus picks, basically, right?
Yeah, I think Wiseman is the guy you're targeting most, and that 21 Timberwolves pick. Those are the two crown jewels in that potential deal. I also think if you're the Warriors, it's just not worth the PR hit to trade Klay Thompson, in the midst of this like horrific injury battle, and not only trade. It's not like you're trading him for who's somebody that's like beloved. You're not trading him for Giannis. I think if you're a Warriors fan, you'd be like, look, this really sucks, but hey, we're getting Giannis. You'd be like, hey, we're trading him for the guy that like you've hated the absolute most over the last 5 years.
Absolute impossible sell to the fan base. Right. That would not happen.
Comically bad PR move.
Yeah.
All right, so we have about 10 more minutes here. Let's actually closer to 8 minutes. So we'll have to make this quick, but let's run through some of the new offerings on the DK Sportsbook. They continue to add player and team futures. There's a few new ones that just propped up in the last 24 hours, I should say. So we've talked about title odds, and James and I are going to do the win total over-unders or win percentage over-unders this season. We'll record that on Wednesday. But let's look at Coach of the Year. These odds are new. Steve Nash opens up as the favorite at 9-1. Rick Carlisle 10-1. Monty Williams in Phoenix 10-1. Spo 12-1. Brad Stevens 12-1, and Frank Vogel, the defending champion, also 12-1.
I think Nash is the favorite. I think that makes sense. If you assume that just also relies a lot on Kyrie and Durant playing healthy. Now there's an angle where those guys get hurt and the team still does really well, and that's because of Steve Nash's coaching. That I think he kind of gets the bump there. Other than that, I don't have any strong feel on someone to be Coach of the Year. Honestly, I wish I had a super strong take. I just don't. Doc Rivers and Philly, if they play really well, I can see that. But I feel like you also have to get to a team where there wasn't this giant move by the general manager or something. A bunch of players coming in, that kind of disqualifies Nash to some extent. Maybe it is Doc Rivers because they sent out talent, right? They increased fit but sent out talent. So if they can climb to third in the Eastern Conference, maybe that does it.
Right. I love the Doc call. I think because like we said, they underperformed so much last season that if he kind of comes in and all of a sudden they're the 1 or the 2 seed in the East and he gets the label as the Embiid Simmons whisperer, I really think that the narrative could fall towards him. I don't mind Nash being the favorite, honestly, just because one, everybody loves Steve Nash, and too, it would kind of be like a Steve Kerr situation where, yeah, you're walking into like a ready-made situation, but if that team is as good as we think it can be, and they win like, I don't know, I don't want to do the math, but like if they had the equivalent of like a 62 win season, I don't know, like I feel like he would almost get it by default, right? There'd be all this credit for like, man, he's managing these personalities so well.
Yeah, probably. Do you want to talk about, are there any bets that you see for teams to reach or not reach the playoffs that really stick out to you? Like for me, as a Grizzlies pessimist, Grizzlies to miss the playoffs at minus 225 is free money, especially with Jaren Jackson out. That's one that just stood out to me, like scrolling through the list. Also, the Warriors to miss the playoffs, plus 160. That's fine with me. Like, I would take that.
I would take that just in the event that Steph Curry gets hurt. I think that's a real possibility. I think the margin for error with things like that is going to be so much lower this year, right? Where, if a player misses 4 weeks, that's like 20 games. So, that's something to keep an eye on, as far as guys who have been injury risks in the past. I mean, one thing that stood out to me is that OKC has the same odds to miss the playoffs as the Lakers do to make the playoffs, like plus minus 10,000. So those are viewed as like absolute stone cold locks on both ends. Other than that, I mean, for the most part, I thought it felt just about right. A lot of the really bad teams, there's not a lot of value in betting that they won't make the playoffs. Like Detroit's only 9-1 to make the playoffs, but they're 20-1 to not make the playoffs.
Right. I would almost rather bet on the Pistons making the playoffs in that case, because if Blake and Derrick Rose stay healthy and they stay on the team, they add Jeremy Grant, Mason Plumlee, and like rookies like DeLon Wright. They kind of have a team now, weirdly.
The other one I like is the Pelicans at minus 175 to miss the playoffs. I don't understand the Pelicans hype. I feel like they got worse.
I think they got worse too. The more I look at that depth chart, it's hard to look at. Like it just
their implied win total is like 7 wins higher than what they were on pace for last year. Where are these coming from?
They definitely got worse. Like they've Bledsoe, like Steven Adams and Zion. There's no spacing on this team. Like I don't know. Melly is not even that good. Redick is another year older. It's just awkward.
What do you think of the Hawks? Kind of being in the minus to make the playoffs. Minus 122 to make the playoffs. Plus 100 to miss.
I mean, I'm okay with that. I'm pretty high on the Hawks this year. I mean, it's going to be a big jump for them. They won 20 games last year, 47 losses, but a lot of that, John Collins was out for 25 plus. He had the 25 game suspension. They played really well when he was on the court. I think the signings they got make sense. Capella is going to be a huge help for them. I'm fine with them being a minus to make the playoffs, honestly.
Well, that could be factoring into the when they get Harden. Obviously, that'll change things a little bit. I assume Vegas is in on that. Yeah. Other than that, it's pretty tough for me to pick out any that I really love. I mean, I would definitely bet against the Kings making the playoffs, but you're not getting a lot of value there. That's minus 625.
How do you feel about so this is division winner, the Portland Trailblazers at plus 350 to win the Northwest, and that would be over the Nuggets, Jazz, Timberwolves, Thunder. I think it's decent value, 3-1, 4-1, basically on the Trailblazers to win the division. I don't know there are no other bets. I mean, Dallas minus 225 to win the Southwest. Is that a lock? Rockets, Pelicans, Grizzlies, Spurs?
I mean, it should be. That's a lock. I do like that quite a bit. Again, though, I just feel like, there's just so many risks as far as, if the player gets COVID, you're out a week, you're basically out 2 weeks minimum. I think that's going to throw things off, but it's also hard to pinpoint who those players are. It could be LeBron James or it could be Samaj Christian. It really, there's no possible way of knowing how that's going to work. I think in a similar vein, Miami at minus 360 to win the Southeast should be a lock.
Yep. I agree.
Let's see. We'll have to save the player futures for a future episode, but I will ask you real quickly as a wrap up. Leading scorer next season, James Harden is still the heavy favorite at plus 125.
I feel like because he's such a heavy favorite that you're getting good value on a lot of other players. Doncic at plus 650, Lillard at plus 650, Westbrook at plus 900, not even horrible. Like Tatum is at plus 5,000. Will you be shocked if he averaged 30 a game?
For 50 to 1, not at all. Nothing would shock
me. That's what I mean.
Hi, fans. Please like our video and subscribe to the RotoWire channel. Then please go to rotowire.com/pod for a free 10-day trial.